Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Pro Democracy Pod. Our guest today needs no introduction. It's independent report. I'm going to give an introduction anyways, but it's independent reporter Michael Tracey. Lately, he's been reporting on a lot of the illogical excesses of pandemic response, especially at universities. There's two things that I really like about Michael as a journalist. One is that he's just like a really amazing writer. He's just like really good. Uh, Always smart, always careful with his words, and careful in his debunking of others' words. And you can see that in the article that he wrote, which we'll be talking about today. The fakest whistleblower ever. It's on a Substack. And the other thing I really like about Michael, excuse me, I have a thing in my throat. Is that he's really just not afraid to go against the grain. He doesn't care what the Twitter horde has to say about what he's doing. And that's like just so uncommon in this day and age. So we're super pleased to have him on today. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for buttering me up right off the bat. Now I'm going to go easy on you.
So I actually have an article that's coming out. Michael's been given a sneak peek. Unfortunately, it was not able to be published prior to tonight's episode, but I suspect in the next hour or so you'll be able to read it on thegrayzone.com. And it's about the Facebook whistleblower, the so-called Facebook whistleblower, I should say, because she's really
or whistleblower in really exaggerated scare quotes.
Yeah, extra large font. I reading your piece. Where you talk about what I like about your piece is that you really you honed in on this idea that Frances Haugen is promoting, that she's not a political actor. One thing you say, she talks about how she worked on counter espionage at Facebook. And you're like, really, counter espionage, you say, against officially designated adversaries of the US government. That has nothing to do with politics. What a joke. So I think that's such a great example of how the media is spinning all of this. Her message is kind of uniting Republicans and Democrats. One thing I point out in my article is Ted Cruz asking her about, quote, content that is harmful to the children. And meanwhile, she's nodding her head as Senator Dan Sullivan calls Iran the world's greatest or largest state sponsor of terror, and communist China the US's number one adversary. So I was wondering, Michael, if you could talk a little bit about how this is being spun from a political angle, or as they say, a non-political angle.
Yeah, well, ironically, it's often a very effective political tactic, or it's an effective tactic to achieve a political goal, to brand yourself as non-political, right? Because if you do express an overtly partisan motivation, then for obvious reasons, it's much easier for one party or the other to just discount you and dismiss you as somebody who's operating kind of narrowly in the domain of electoral politics or electoral political advocacy. So over and over again, you see examples of advocates really making a conscious PR choice to cast themselves as not political. But when they say they're not political, they mean that in the very kind of narrowly circumscribed sense of just Democrats versus Republicans. So if you're not promoting one partisan political interest over the other, that means you're somehow not political, as though there are no other dimensions of what it means to be a political actor. So Frances Haugen, in her Senate testimony, 2 days magically after she somehow appeared on 60 Minutes with this kind of choreographed introduction to the nation, complete with the a ready-made verified Twitter account at her disposal. She goes to this Senate hearing and she's trying to impress. She probably succeeds in impressing the assembled senators, Republicans and Democrats, by going over her background at Facebook and working in something called counter espionage ops, and how this gives her all these kinds of really, impressive and serious national security bona fides. And, so she adopts this kind of jargon of national security lingo, which I think I could very easily imagine her talking to her PR handlers, like you wrote about this organization, Whistleblower Aid, founded by this guy John Ty and then Mark Zayed.
I'm actually not sure.
Okay. And, it's basically a legal group, advocacy group / PR house. And I could very easily imagine one of them, probably Zaid, Zaid, I think is the spelling of the name.
That's the spelling, yeah.
Yeah. I'll just say Zaid, just out of for convenience. I can very much easily imagine this guy Zaid advising Frances Haugen to emphasize her supposed background in national security, because that's going to give her more credibility among particularly the Republicans who might have some pre-existing skepticism about an employee at a place like Facebook, which they assume is going to be liberal-leaning, or they assume is going to be somehow advocating for censorship, which they believe disproportionately targets conservatives, right? But if she can kind of supersede that by underscoring, her background in national security and telling the senators that they have a duty to protect America and
keep Americans safe, as you she said that and you pointed that out.
Right. And she can help them do that by feeding them this information that she gleaned from her kind of privileged position at Facebook. So, that's a really almost shrewdly political tack that she took. It's extremely political. And, by the way, it shouldn't even be remotely controversial to assert that she's engaging in political activity, because she's sitting in a Senate hearing. And she's clearly tailoring her rhetoric to have the maximum effect. So actually, like, the method she uses to kind of to mollify the Republicans are pretty illustrative as to her overall just savvy. Because she combines the national security side, where she's talking about how at Facebook she, as you mentioned, she had this exchange with Dan Sullivan, a Republican, kind of a conventional Republican from Alaska, and she's agreeing with him about how Iran is the chief state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and at Facebook she helped kind of counter some of the espionage operations emanating out of Iran and China. She doesn't specify what those operations were exactly, or what espionage she was supposedly contending with. I mean, was it just memes or something? Who knows? I mean, that was certainly the case with Russiagate, when we were told that there was espionage happening on these social media networks, and it turned out to be like a ragtag collection of like nonsense
Jesus memes,
Twitter
masturbation memes.
Yeah, stuff like that. So I mean, using that criteria could be easily the same kind of thing that can be blown up very conveniently if you're trying, if you have a self-interest in doing so. But anyway, so she combines that whole national security shtick with, as you also alluded to, this kind of appeal to the children. Because, adults, whether Republican or Democrat, do have a natural instinct to protect children. And if she's saying that she's just, she's motivated by a pure-hearted desire to ensure that children aren't damaged by their social media consumption habits, then she's going to get a hearing across the political spectrum, at least in a place like the Senate. And that also actually helps her appeal to Republicans who, kind of have historically, if they're more socially conservative, they're more inclined to be like hyper vigilant about protecting, children, and especially girls, from like corrupting images or videos or whatever that might consume online. So this is kind of an extension of that also, in a way. And so, I mean, it's almost nakedly political, her tactic. But even leaving aside how her whole background in national security makes her pretty indisputably political, maybe not in a kind of superficial partisan sense, but in a broader sense. I mean, she also isn't too bashful about revealing her other partisan preferences. I mean, for one thing, as you linked to in your piece, I mean, she has given like hundreds and hundreds of dollars, I think thousands, to just Democratic Party campaign organizations. She gave money to like Jamie Harrison, who was a Senate candidate in South Carolina last fall, who lost dramatically, but was, I think, raised the most money of any Senate candidate ever. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I could be misremembering that, but it's something like that.
Might be, but
I mean, Jamie Harrison, who is like an incredibly long shot Senate candidate in South Carolina, running against Lindsey Graham in 2020, just raised a gargantuan amount of money because his kind of candidacy went viral because people wanted to beat Lindsey Graham and whatnot. Lindsey Graham ended up winning in a landslide, but Jamie Harrison had just a gigantic intake of money. And it's interesting because Frances Haugen gave money to Jamie Harrison. So it kind of indicates that she's sort of plugged into kind of Democratic kind of activist tendencies if she knew to give money to that particular candidate, right? And there was another congressional candidate, or a Senate candidate who she gave money to, Teresa Greenfield, who's running in Iowa, who also lost, but had a similar kind of momentum behind her within Democratic circles, and was also being flooded with small dollar donations in 2020. So that gives you some. So I mean, that alone gives you some indication of what her predilections are politically, right? But beyond that, I mean, a really telling example that I gave in my Substack article is that she was participating in this Yale Law School Zoom event. I mean, she had so many events lined up for the week that she that she went public. It was astonishing. I mean, she really has a professional PR operation. So not just the Senate hearing, but she has this Yale Law School thing. She was meeting with European commissioners, all other kinds of meetings and events, seemingly, and at this Yale Law School event, she was kind of posed a question by the moderator asking, is there anything about Facebook that we should want to preserve, right? Is it all bad, or as you're seeming to suggest, or should we try to just modify the Facebook architecture somewhat and hold on to the good that can come out of it? And she cited as an example of something that's worth preserving that had come out of Facebook, a group that was formed after the 2016 election called Pantsuit Nation, which was a bunch of, chagrined Hillary Clinton supporters who, were gathered together in desperation after Trump won an unexpected victory, and were kind of organizing amongst themselves and, joined like the Women's March and all these other kind of mainline Democratic Party endeavors, right? And it just gained a huge amount of followers. Apparently, I think she said something like 12 million in 2 weeks or something crazy like that. So that was an example of something that Haugen apparently believes ought to be preserved. I mean, that was something that was good that came out of Facebook. She didn't cite, a radical left-wing group. She didn't cite a Republican or conservative group. She didn't cite any other potential groups that she might have cited to give an example of what is good that can come out of Facebook organization-wise for political kind of campaigns. She cited just a mainline Democratic Party group, right? So, I mean, what does that tell you? You don't have to, that kind of speaks for itself, right? Which is why I think she has gone out of her way to adopt rhetorical strategies like the national security angle and like the think of the children angle to appeal specifically to Republicans and give her this kind of impression that she's non-political at all. And she might even think that she's blowing the whistle for a non-overtly political end, right? I mean, it could also be a genuine conviction on her part that she's not doing something that's straightforwardly political, but a lot of people have very stunted and limited conceptions of what it means to be political. And that definitely applies to her.
Yeah. One thing that's kind of in line with what we can see of her political views, I noticed, it should be pointed out, she said she was fighting counter-espionage information operations. So I want to hone in on that term information operations for a second, because in her cookie cutter Twitter account, and I reveal in my article that she had an old Twitter account, I found it, but that was blocked when she went public and then deleted. But in her new Twitter account, one of the people that she follows is Renee DiResta, who was involved with a company that undertook this information operation called Project Birmingham in the 2018 midterm elections. And what this was an operation to create fake social media accounts giving a pro GOP message to then blame on Russia. It was a false flag operation. And Renee DiResta was involved with that. And yet
that was in the special election in 2007. Wasn't it in 2017?
You could be right.
Doug Jones versus Roy Moore, if I'm not mistaken.
It was the Roy Moore election, but I actually didn't include that in my article, but that's one of the like 60 or so people that she's following on Twitter. So, I mean, not only is she willing to, is she following like these Democrat activists, but also people who have engaged in actual information operations that are disinformation, literal disinformation. But, you know, one thing I want to talk about regarding your piece, Michael, before I talk a little bit about my own, you know, you really cut through this idea that she's promoted, which is that she's not promoting censorship, right? And you have a quote that I think I saved it somewhere. No, I didn't. But you know, basically your argument is that, you know, how can you advocate for more content moderation or for deranking certain ideas and then say that's not censorship? So if you could get to the heart of that.
Yeah, like at this Yale Law School function, she was rebutting this notion that she was an advocate for censorship. Like she was saying she was not advocating content-based censorship. And that's why everybody across the spectrum should join hands with her and implement her preferred policy goals, which includes creating a Facebook regulatory board within the federal government that would become like a revolving door for people like her. I mean, she says there should be an entity within the federal government for people like me, Frances Haugen, to kind of go back and forth between Silicon Valley and Washington and use the insights that we gained from working at Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Google, and then regulate our prior industry. So she's actually making a pretty unabashed case for just the kind of the standard revolving door system that governs the Washington kind of lobbying apparatus. And you know, everyone was, you know, she's giving this recommendation. Everyone's saying yes, thank goodness, and then they'll turn around and, you know, bemoan like the kind of systemic corruption in the lobbying system. Well, that's what she's arguing for. You know, you don't think the Facebook regulatory board is going to be lobbied by the same companies that the members of that board just work for? I mean, it's ridiculous. But she's so that's one of her policy prescriptions for how to improve Facebook and other social media. And but she's saying that one thing that she doesn't want to do is to like adjudicate the permissibility of individual content. And what she's saying is that, you know, the algorithm shouldn't serve you up content based on like what you've clicked on or what you've engaged with, which is what, you know, Facebook does in its news feed. It's what Twitter does to some extent. It's what a lot of social media does. And, you know, there is an argument. And actually, sometimes I even personally just switch on the chronological function because I'd rather see that at times than what the algorithm kind of serves up to me based on what it like divines that I want to see. But
yeah, whoever is the Twitter main character of the day, which is often you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I hope I'm the hero as opposed to the villain. Anyway, yeah, but so I mean, in a way, like her saying that we should go back to chronological ordering of news feeds and stuff. I mean, that's not entirely unreasonable, but she's saying that because she's making an expressly content-based decision or determination about the undesirability of certain content that gets prioritized by these algorithms. She's saying that what gets prioritized by these algorithms is extreme content or divisive content or polarizing content or content that doesn't further the public good, whatever that means. I mean, getting back to the whole thing about how she's supposedly not political, she's running around saying that we have to do what's required to promote the civic good, as if, first of all, she's a philosopher king and she's like spent decades studying what the civic good means and has consulted with all like the leading scholars throughout the world and come up with like a manifesto and is going to be heralded in a pantheon alongside like Plato or something. But like, what could be a more obviously political than like competing notions of what constitutes the civic good? I mean, that's what politics is. But she's saying that she's just this objective kind of chronicler of like all that is right and true in the universe or something. I don't know. But she says that, the civic good will be served by not having these algorithmic processes. Well, okay, maybe we shouldn't have the algorithmic processes, but you're saying those algorithms should be modified and regulated because of your own content-based determination about the bad stuff that you're claiming that they turn up. I mean, she's making a content-based decision about how misinformation gets promoted by the algorithm. So she is advocating for censorship, she's advocating for a content-based intervention into social media so that material that deemed harmful by her and the people that will presumably comprise this regulatory agency that she's suggesting, they will be overseeing the content on these social media platforms, and they'll suggest algorithmic tweaks so that the bad stuff isn't emphasized. And what have we seen happen with that in the past? Well, I'm sure you know this better than anybody, somebody who worked for the Gray Zone. But even like alternative media gets accused of being misinformation, or media from foreign countries gets accused of being somehow in league with espionage. And it's this stuff over and over again. So of course she's the only reason she's apparently come public with her recommendations is because she's made a content-based determination that the stuff served up by social media, namely Facebook, is in its content somehow bad or dangerous or harmful. So she is making a censorship determination there. She's just kind of doing this little end run so it doesn't seem quite like she's advocating censorship, but the practical effect of what she's advocating is censorship.
Well, you invoke this in your article, you talk about how she invokes the specter of China and Iran, and that seems to also kind of relate to how a lot of alternative media is treated. Like you see people try to tie alternative media to China or Iran or Russia all the time. And so it kind of seems like this is the new sort of tactic of censoring new media. You're not like explicitly taking it off the internet, but you're, affiliating it with the scary bad guys.
Yeah, or you're affiliating it just, even if it's not that you're tying it to a foreign state or a state that's deemed adversarial to the U.S., you're tying it into this general notion of misinformation, which could include, state-sponsored social media content, or it could include anything that might be seen to enable that content or amplify that content. So if you share something from, a Russian state agency or an Iranian-backed media outlet or something, or at least an outlet that's claimed to be Iranian-backed. I mean, sometimes the provenance of these supposed, state relations are not that clear.
Yeah.
You amplify it, you could be accused of abetting somehow this kind of foreign state-backed disinformation campaign, right? I mean, this was actually done all throughout Russiagate as well, which, even, if you look at the Mueller report, it would go through and document how many times like Donald Trump Jr. shared an account or retweeted some account that they had concluded was based in Russia or something, and therefore he was somehow in league with Russian disinformation. So yeah, it's kind of just putting everything all into this nefarious kind of cluster of bad information and stigmatizing it that way and using that stigma as a justification to implement censorship tactics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the attribution is always murky and much murkier than they present it. You mentioned that I've done work for the Gray Zone, but I also worked at RT throughout the 2016 elections and a few years following that. So I saw firsthand how what we were doing was not misinformation. In fact, we were we were, I think, reporting better than most outlets on many left-wing causes. Standing Rock would be a great example of that. Occupy Wall Street prior to my time there. But nonetheless,
I remember first becoming aware of RT
at
due to Occupy Wall Street.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they were providing some of the best on the ground covers. But the idea supposedly was that they were only covering it because it reflected badly on the U.S. and that, by extension, advanced the geopolitical interest of Russia.
Sowing discord, as the intelligence community called it. But, for example, I was among a group of people that were asked to come up with hashtags for RT's election coverage in 2016. And Twitter had actually come to RT offering them a advertising package. And it was too expensive, so RT turned it down. Eventually, there was an agreement that was made, but it was significantly less money than the original offer from Twitter. So I was a part of that, and then we were all of a sudden banned from Twitter for engaging in misinformation. But I'll tell you my perspective, and there was no misinformation. The problem was that they weren't sufficiently duteous to Hillary Clinton. They portrayed her oftentimes in a negative light, much as they did with Donald Trump too. I mean, they weren't exactly easy on Trump at the time either, but it was supposed to be Trump bad all the time, Hillary Clinton's queen. So they were punished for that severely. And it just shows you how this misinformation designation is totally contextual to and tied to the agenda of the United States government in terms of foreign policy.
Well, of course it is. I mean, and actually, just to interject quickly there, one of the positives of Frances Haugen's whole PR tour is that it's shed light on the very thing you just mentioned there, which is the arbitrariness and capriciousness of how this misinformation label is applied. Because this guy, Nick Clegg, who was the former deputy prime minister of the UK and is now some vice president of communications or whatever for Facebook, he's actually had to go around and address some of these allegations from Haugen on TV. And there was one interview that he did with some obscure kind of think tank functionary, where he actually admitted that Facebook used to ban any mention that the COVID virus potentially was from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. Now, I don't want to litigate that exactly, but there's at least. But should that have been banned? Should any mention of that have been banned from Facebook, regardless of whether you think it's a valid theory?
I think it promoted. But it had the opposite effect.
Right, but Nick Clegg admitted that they went along with scientific consensus at the time and banned that information, but then scientific consensus suddenly shifted, and now they no longer ban discussion of that topic. So that couldn't be more of an outright admission that their whole criteria around what supposedly constitutes misinformation is totally contingent on just the fleeting sort of whims of whatever is seen to be the consensus, whether scientific, political or otherwise, on a given day.
No, you're absolutely right about that point. And I think we should avoid the lab leak debate for today. Okay. But I'm going to end our
check out our episode because on China, because we did cover it.
So you did cover it? Okay.
We have covered it. I'm going to end the Periscope or the Twitter Live, whatever they call it now, at this point. I hope that everybody joins us over on Rockfin.
By the way, I'm also on Rockfin, and people can subscribe to that if they like.
I should have mentioned that. Yeah, follow.
I'm not live on Rockfin right now. I mean, I figured I'll just do it on your channel, and maybe I'll repost it on my channel tomorrow or something.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome to. So please join us over there. I'm going to be talking a little bit about my investigation, but for now, I'm going to open up the floor to Mila.
Yeah, this whole disinformation thing, I think it also came up with the Hunter Biden story as well, where like they censored the laptop thing and people weren't able to like post about the laptop. And I guess like I've been kind of thinking or wondering to myself, like what form, if the form of censorship is going to change, or if we're still going to just stick to that classic, like, you're not allowed to post this, because that seems like a far less effective strategy than just labeling something as disinformation, but like leaving it up. Because if you just don't allow it to be said, it makes people want to actually look into it and investigate it more. This is like the reason, I was reading a judgment for a hate speech case in Canada, and like one of the arguments made is like, when you censor speech this explicitly, people are going to be suspicious and assume that it's correct. And so, like, it's fascinating to me that Facebook or any of these other outlets would even try an outright ban at this point, because labeling it as disinformation seems so much more effective, and like what they do with the gray zone, for instance.
Well, the Hunter Biden laptop thing, that entailed Facebook and Twitter banning the link. Banning the link to a New York Post article which had broke the story of this Hunter Biden laptop and some of the contents of it. And Twitter even banned or suspended the New York Post Twitter account. And the New York Post publishes some trashy stuff. I don't defend it entirely, but I've actually written one thing for them because they asked me to. But it's still a prominent American newspaper, right? And censoring it and forbidding it from tweeting or posting on Facebook is kind of an extreme step that really has ominous implications for press freedom. So it wasn't that people couldn't tweet or post on Facebook about Hunter Biden's laptop per se, so they couldn't share this link, because you had a huge offensive at that time by these former national security state apparatchiks who were saying that this was just the latest example of Russian disinformation trying to intervene in the American electoral process. And there was so the social media companies were petrified of being accused of enabling a repeat of 2016. And by repeat of 2016, what they're petrified of is being the scapegoat if Donald Trump won again, because the heads of the tech companies were hauled before Congress in 2017, 18, 19, and berated for allowing disinformation to fester, allowing Russian interference to promote bad political causes, and ultimately enable Trump to win the election. So, I mean, it was always a diversion tactic among Democrats and kind of allied figures, and some Republicans to pin the blame for an adverse outcome in 2016 on the tech platforms, rather than a whole host of other things that contributed to Trump's victory in 2016, including factors that they were personally culpable in, such as the destruction of the America's industrial base and so on and so forth.
Not going to Michigan, the Pied Piper strategy.
Yeah, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, lest anyone forget that David Corn was actively promoting Trump in the 2016 Republican primaries, because he thought if Trump would win, it would be the easiest candidate for a Democrat to beat, and it would also discredit Republicans. I mean, I have those receipts saved somewhere if anybody doubts me. So anyway, yeah. So when the Hunter Biden story broke, these tech platforms had already been subjected to massive pressure from Congress, from the media, namely the prestige media, and they had already been demanded to more stringently regulate the internet and make content-based determinations about what speech was permissible. They had already really ramped up their banning tactics. I mean, Alex Jones was the first kind of really big one, and he was banned through this kind of coordinated purge campaign. And it culminated with Trump himself being banned after the January 6th fracas. But actually, this bears actually on Frances Haugen, because Frances Haugen proudly has stated that she was a member of this civic integrity team at Facebook, which was in charge with kind of overseeing their kind of disinformation combating activity. And that was the same body at Facebook, presumably, that made the decision to block the Hunter Biden laptop story on totally specious grounds. I mean, it was not Russian disinformation. It's now been the authenticity of that laptop archive has now been confirmed beyond any doubt by a new book by Ben Schreckinger, which I actually have behind me somewhere and I'm reading now. So it actually this all ties into Haugen, because she says the reason why she became so disillusioned with Facebook was not because she just woke up one morning and decided that Facebook was this menace to society. It was because that Facebook dissolved the civic integrity unit, and people who were in her particular like module or whatever, they didn't have the same powers as they did during the election. And so her power had to be diminished internally within Facebook, and she used that as opportunity to become this kind of melodramatic whistleblower. What people like Haugen apparently want, because she's proud of what the civic integrity unit did in 2020. She actually boasts that it worked. Like, it didn't result in a repeat of 2016. Like, and how do you actually evaluate what it would be for there to have been a repeat of 2016? I mean, the only criteria that I can really see is that Trump didn't win in 2020. Yeah. I don't know that she would have boasted of a success if Trump actually had won, and he did come pretty close to winning. I mean, just like 30,000 votes or something had switched in 3 states, he would have won. So I mean, it's totally arbitrary, really, and it does get back to just sort of the capriciousness that this censorship tactics are employed. It's all toward a particular end, and the end in 2020 was we the tech companies cannot be in a position again where we're blamed for enabling Trump's victory, and we're going to pull all the stops to do that. And they did. And Frances Haugen then had that power like gently taken away from her, or partially taken away from her, and she has a total meltdown and becomes a whistleblower. And once you get officially conferred with the title whistleblower, that means like you're now a saint. And it means that you can't be questioned because you've made such a risk and you've taken on such personal sacrifice. Well, I mean, I don't see what major sacrifice Frances Haugen has taken. I mean, could you imagine all the offers she's gotten now to give talks and make money, maybe write a book? I mean, it doesn't seem like she's suffering very much. I mean, she has this professional PR operation behind her, and she's being feted by some of the most powerful institutions in the world. So, I mean, she seems to be doing fine. And it's a sort of an ironic situation because, I'm not trying to defend Facebook per se, because, why would I? It's a massively profitable and powerful company. But I mean, there is a way in which Facebook is again being scapegoated for stuff that it really, is not as directly culpable for as is being claimed. Like, somehow Facebook is like, weakening democracy and, causing girls to hate their bodies, and, Instagram does have that effect on some teen girls, sure. But I mean, it's also a long-standing kind of social issue that if you just focus exclusively on Facebook, it kind of misses the forest for the trees in a way, I would say.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Facebook didn't come out when I was like growing up until like a little later, and I can guarantee you people were still hating their bodies back then. It's definitely not that.
I think Instagram is more what they're charging is responsible for girls hating their body, which I'm sure it's contributed. I mean, yeah, it must contribute, and it's not entirely unreasonable to like research the effects of that, but it's kind of furnishing this broader critique of social media that is necessitates more content-based censorship, including political censorship, and they're using the children's issue to kind of as an in to facilitate that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I actually lost my thought, so I apologize. I imagine that Frances Haugen will have a Netflix documentary in the next year and a half. I tend to have this like image in my head of her handlers approaching her in the fashion of like a Hollywood executive and saying something along the lines of I can make you famous. But
I knew there was something sketchy about that Whistleblowers Aid organization. I didn't look that extensively into it, even though I had heard of that guy Zaid and Ty. But I mean, the point that you make in your article is actually really should be underscored, which is that Mark Zaid, especially, he has made it his kind of ideological mission to say that whistleblowing is good, but it has to be like officially approved whistleblowing.
Yeah.
It has to be whistleblowing that is accepted amongst kind of powerful factions in Washington, D.C., or else it's not legitimate whistleblowing. So he actually has gone out of his way to denounce, Julian Assange, Edward Snowden. He was specifically agitating against Trump giving a pardon to Snowden and Assange. Yeah. And yet somehow now he's this esteemed protector of whistleblowers. I mean, that's
even
really
Reality Winner he attacked as
right.
Not a whistleblower. But I'd like to take that opportunity to point out allegations that have been made against Mark Zaid, and this is kind of the top lawyer at Whistleblower Aid, who is technically representing Frances Haugen. John Kiriakou, WikiLeaks. John Kiriakou blew the whistle on CIA's torture program. WikiLeaks and Thomas Drake, another CIA whistleblower, have all raised to varying degrees issues with Mark Zaid's representation of a CIA whistleblower by the name of Jeffrey Sterling. So Sterling actually went to prison. He's recently been released. According to testimony from FBI agent Ashley Hunt during Sterling's trial, the FBI learned that Mark Zaid had a client that was going to go to the media with a, quote, nuclear issue. And they learned that because Mark Zaid and Roy Krieger, his law partner, called them and told them. And they learned that that person was Jeffrey Sterling. So here we have a lawyer whose supposed goal in life is to protect whistleblowers, accused by credible and prominent members of the whistleblower community of ratting out his source to the FBI, and a source who eventually went to prison. So that's just kind of like the tip of the iceberg of Mark Zaid's spooky national security resume points, right? Alongside Mark Zaid, the co-founder of Whistleblower Aid, a guy by the name of John Ty. And before they founded Whistleblower Aid together, Zaid was Ty's lawyer. Ty was at the State Department, and he basically blew the whistle on a subject that had already been whistleblown on, right? It's a executive order called 12333, 12333. So what this does is this allows the NSA to collect a lot of data on American citizens. And it was actually Edward Snowden who revealed that this was the main source of NSA's data collection on American citizens. So after he blew the whistle, John Ty was still at the State Department, and he started getting briefings from the NSA about how about dealing with the fallout from these leaks. So after that, he decided he was going to blow the whistle on this program, which again, Snowden already blew the whistle on it. So he's totally indebted to Snowden. Nonetheless, Mark Zaid, his lawyer, in this legal process, he went through this officially sanctioned process of blowing the whistle within the State Department. Zaid repeatedly denounced Snowden. Of course, he's called for Snowden to be prosecuted and go to prison for leaking this information that he did. So, despite being totally indebted to him, that was how their media presentation was at the time. That was back in 2014. And what's funny to me is this preferred method that Zaid has of going through the official channels, and John Ty as well. It yielded nothing for them. Executive Order 12333 has not been reformed at all since that time. in 2014. Meanwhile, I'm not an expert on this subject, but I would say that Edward Snowden and Julian Assange and others have had significantly more impact. John Kiriakou as well, I should say. So it's also interesting, and another thing I want to point out really quickly is that John Tai, after leaving the State Department, joined this kind of regime change online activist group called Avaz, and he was like a high-ranking leader there. And this is an organization which advocated, it was a chief advocate of the no-fly zone in Libya, which led to the death by rape by a bayonet of Muammar Gaddafi, which caused Libya to become a failed state. Currently, they have 3 warring governments and open-air slave markets where Black Africans are sold. And then Avaz did the same in Syria, and that was at the time that John Tai was working there. And in fact, there was a lot of pressure against this organization because of how devastating the no-fly zone was over Libya, that they were again advocating one in Syria. And John Tai himself was the one kind of responsible for damage control, and he was putting out comments pushing back against the criticism they were getting for advocating that no-fly zone. So, both John Tai, Mark Zaid, they were very much pushing for regime change in various places, and generally hostile towards foreign governments. Another person who is representing and giving interviews on Frances Haugen's behalf is Andrew Bakaj. I may be saying his name wrong, but this guy is an actual former CIA agent. He was also a criminal prosecutor for the Department of Defense. And both him and Zaid have been over the past years or so. I'm not exactly sure of how long they've been doing this, but they've been representing people who, U.S. government officials who have allegedly contracted Havana syndrome. So they're very much like in line with the national security establishment. And this is being, totally glossed over by the media. Another thing worth pointing out before I stop talking about my article is Libby Liu, the CEO of Whistleblower Aid, who was at Radio Free Asia, which is a U.S. government propaganda outlet started by the CIA. She was there for 16 years, and through Radio Free Asia, she oversaw the creation of what's called the Open Technology Fund. So it's a U.S. government charitable foundation, really, for lack of a better term, that gives grants towards startups and other techie kind of stuff that they think will be useful towards United States foreign policy imperatives. 2 examples would be Signal and Tor, which incidentally, Whistleblower Aid uses Tor to get the documents that its leakers or its whistleblowers want to give them. So she was the president and the founder of Open Technology Fund. So you really don't get much spookier than these people, right? You have somebody who worked for 16 years at an outlet created by the CIA. You have a literal CIA agent, and you have a whistleblower attorney who is accused by prominent people in the whistleblowing community of ratting out a source to the intelligence community. And then you have John Tai, who is just as much a fake whistleblower as Frances Haugen. So, I think that it's likely that Frances Haugen was coached by these people. In fact, Whistleblower Aid admits that they provide coaching, media training, that kind of thing. It's not just a mere legal aid group. And, I think what's interesting about Frances Haugen is how she merges kind of the U.S. national securities state's censorship agenda with the Democrats, right? So not only is she going after Iran and China, but also after she's going to be testifying at the January 6th committee. So I hope that everybody gets a chance to check that out on the Gray Zone. It should be up tonight or tomorrow morning or something, because there's a lot of details that I didn't touch on. I don't know if Mila or you, Michael, have anything that you want to ask or add.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason Frances Haugen was so readily embraced as this, enlightened whistleblower was because she's giving powerful factions ammunition for what they wanted to do anyway. Whether it's the January 6th committee, whether it's the push to more regulate speech on social media, and on and on and on. She's not challenging any establishment orthodoxies at all. She's strengthening them. And that's why she was conferred with this whistleblower title so seamlessly, thanks to her professional PR and legal operation. And as far as Zaid, I mean, I think it was actually very interesting that you highlighted that part of his whole philosophy in protecting whistleblowers, and part of the reason why he denounced Snowden and Assange was because he was doing so on behalf of his clients within the intelligence community. That's why Zaid was against Snowden and Assange. He was speaking on behalf of the national security state, essentially, or at least elements within it. And Zaid makes it clear, as you pointed out, that he will not work with any whistleblower who seeks to disclose classified information. And what more kind of consequential whistleblowing is there? I mean, that's the kind of whistleblowing that you need. Right. Otherwise, the most important documents about what the government is doing will be kept under wraps using kind of ridiculous criteria through the federal government's overclassification regime. But that's not acceptable or legitimate whistleblowing, according to Zaid. That's criminality, or that's just espionage, or treason or something. I mean, so I don't even know if Daniel Ellsberg would have been an acceptable client for Zaid. That's because Ellsberg was accused of violating the law. To my knowledge, Haugen is not accused of violating any law. I mean, maybe Facebook could sue her or something, but I'm sure she'd have a very well endowed legal defense should that happen. And it seems unlikely that Facebook would even try to sue her because number one, this oversight board, which is this kind of like quasi judicial body that Facebook formed, which is like technically independent but really isn't, of the Facebook kind of corporate hierarchy. They're bringing her back to Facebook to brief them, they said, on her findings and her activities. So, I mean, if she really were this kind of, renegade or something, or if she was like a fugitive, hiding because of the ramifications of her heroic whistleblowing, would she really be brought back to Facebook to just have a chat? I mean, it seems unlikely. But the other whistleblowers who actually did take great personal risk and did incur sacrifice, like Ellsberg or Snowden or Assange, they're not welcome back into these powerful institutions. And, I think that really tells you all you need to know about the difference between the kind of officially sanctioned and officially legitimated whistleblower like Haugen and others who actually go against the grain and buck establishment wisdom in order to promulgate information to the public that otherwise would have been kept secret.
Yeah, and once again, Mark Zaid gives John Ty as the shining example of how it's done. And John Ty blew the whistle on something that was already exposed. And his whistleblowing amounted to nothing in terms of policy change. And meanwhile, the public is no more enlightened. And nobody knows who he is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of interesting how this nomenclature of whistleblower can get leveraged, and give you sort of extra status within even kind of these elite legal societies or within the national security community. It's kind of been appropriated for a whole variety of different ends because it has this kind of connotation of virtue and selflessness. Even if, the person who the title has been given to hasn't earned the impression of having those virtues. But once the title is given, then it just sits there, and all of a sudden, she's officially referred to as whistleblower Frances Haugen. Well, like, what if I don't think she's a whistleblower? I mean, she hasn't used whistleblower law. There is federal law designed to protect and facilitate bona fide whistleblowing. I mean, Frances Haugen hasn't done that. She just declares herself a whistleblower. She puts FB whistleblower in her Twitter bio. I mean, I don't know of any other whistleblower who uses the term whistleblower as a branding exercise. So it's very weird.
It seems there's this cultural moment right now, especially in the US, where people really want to there's the idealized person is seen as rebellious, but not rebellious enough to actually challenge power. But you don't say the second part. You can't say but you're not challenging power. And so you end up with these people, for instance, these Clinton people calling themselves the resistance. And it's what are you resisting? And I kind of noticed this in your new article on Tom Morello as well. There's this sort of idealized rebel aesthetic, but none of these rebels who take on these labels are actually deviating from the establishment at all. It's kind of funny, but it's also concerning.
Well, I mean, large commercial outfits like the New York Times, which Tom Morello is now a newsletter contributor to, he's raging against the machine from within the New York Times and fighting the power. The New York the commercial outfits like the New York Times and just the advertising industry writ large have always for decades absorbed this aesthetic of rebelliousness or of quote dissent or protest or something, because it gives their products this feeling of edginess or something that will make people want to spend money. So it's not necessarily a unique thing, but yeah, you're right that kind of the whole rhetoric around resistance or putting our bodies on the line and stuff like this has gotten much more assertive, even amongst people whose political programs are not radical at all. I mean, the most radicalized faction in the past several years, under Trump, and now I guess to some extent under Biden, it's always aimed at Republicans, and you have to be so radical at denouncing Republicans for how horrible they are. It's not really about having a radical program per se. Mm-hmm. It's kind of ratcheting up the rhetoric. So Trump and the Republicans are fascists. They're doing an insurrection. They're instituting a white nationalist tyranny or something. I mean, that's sort of extreme rhetoric on the surface, but it's not necessarily connected to any kind of radical political critique. It's just that you think that your political enemies are radically bad, and so you have middle-aged moms, in going around and claiming that they're putting their bodies on the line because they knelt at a George Floyd protest. And now, that whole sensibility gets incorporated into kind of the commercial firmament of for-profit America.
Well, and you see this a lot on the far left too, where, for example, Antifa in DC, when there were these rallies this past month in defense or in support of the January 6th defendants, Antifa held counter protests saying that they were going to stop the fash. So, if you look at it in a certain way, they're kind of trying to help out the Capitol Police, which is totally antithetical to what they're supposed to be about.
Or they want people kept in prison.
Yeah, right. And they're abolitionists.
Yeah.
And then you have, communist groups that are calling anyone who protests a mask mandate fascist, right? So, both the anarchist far left and the communist far left have kind of fallen into this place where they're protesting in service of the Democratic Party's agenda. And it's, it's the same kind of radical aesthetic that the whistleblower has, or Tom Morello, as we've been talking about.
Yeah, I wrote a piece last August of 2020. Sorry, about how Kamala Harris, when she was the vice presidential nominee at that point, and she was participating in some Senate hearing. I think it was a Homeland Security subcommittee hearing, and basically she was mounting a defense of the protesters in Portland. So she was basically singing the praises of protesters who, if she actually went to Portland, as I did, and took a look at what they were about, and I don't know that she would have been, totally on board with those people. But because Antifa, last summer had basically become connected with the Democratic Party as in concert, like pursuant to this big protest movement. They basically got official endorsements from kind of normie Democrats because Antifa was seen as synonymous with Black Lives Matter, and of course Kamala Harris and major Democrats are never going to criticize Black Lives Matter. And so they ended up doing this kind of bizarre, ironic endorsement of insurrectionary anarchists who are functionally advancing the Democratic Party. I mean, very strange situation. But yeah, it is interesting how these kind of radical. I think the constant frenzy and paranoia about the looming specter of the Trump, MAGA right, or the white nationalist insurrectionist right, that makes it so that these left groups or tendencies or kind of affiliates end up kind of congealing around one another in a way that hadn't previously been the case so much, because they think that they're obliged to put on like a popular front against the fascist threat. And so that has some really kind of counterintuitive consequences.
It was cooler when it was Arabs being the threat.
Yeah.
Made me feel special. No, I'm just kidding. But
I find you personally threatening, so it's fine.
Okay, cool.
Well, one point that I made a few episodes ago on our podcast is that the far left and the Democratic Party want to crack down on Facebook to prevent political organizing, like what happened on January 6th, right? That's like the main talking point is, Facebook was used to organize this insurrection. But at the same time, the Facebook is used by the far left all the time to organize politically. I as a field reporter for years, I would stay up to date on what kind of protests were happening in New York and Washington, D.C. Through Facebook events, right? When Unite the Right 2.0 happened in Washington, D.C., the whole left and a lot of even people more in the center left were furious when Facebook took down the page of the counter protest to Unite the Right, took down the event page that had thousands of people signed up and RSVP'd to go. Whenever a Black person is killed by the police, people use Facebook to create an event to go out and organize a response to that. So in a way, they're advocating against their own interests.
Well, or they're hoping that the people who are making these censorship decisions are going to be in affinity with them, and therefore they're not going to apply these new standards equitably. And it's just like a method to disadvantage political faction that they don't like, including Trump supporters and whoever else.
That seems so naive to me, though. Like it's kind of hard to believe that they don't know that it's going to be used against them, or do you think they just don't have like long-term
Well, I mean, it seems feasible that if they get enough, like if Frances Haugen's dream comes true, right, and they do have a regulatory body set up where it's people of Frances Haugen's ilk running that regulatory board and making these content-based determinations about what content is permissible on Facebook or other platforms, then those people are probably going. If it's a Democratic administration, right? I mean, those people are going to appointing the members of the regulatory body. The people in that body are going to probably be much more tolerant of the center left and even the left, organizing on these platforms, and they're going to deem right-wing groups to be more prone to violence or insurrection or something. So maybe it does still boomerang on them. It probably will in certain kind of discrete circumstances, but there could just be a general kind of tilt or bias, which disadvantages their political enemies and advantages them. If they get the right personnel in there.
Well, I just know a lot. Like, I know a few people who had their Facebook accounts suspended, and they were like anarchists. I would think that the left particularly would know this from like the Palestine issue, but maybe I'm not even thinking of the same people when I say that. I don't know, but it's weird because you see like Palestine stuff get censored all the time. And so maybe they don't see that as like the left, or maybe they see that as like just something worth sacrificing. I don't know.
Well, and then what happens if there's like another situation like Ferguson, where you have a Democrat president? What if Kamala Harris, is elected in 2024? I doubt it, but and there's this like insane police response to that. I mean, back in the day, Rand Paul was on the side of the Ferguson protesters.
Rand Paul did the hands up, don't shoot on the floor of the Senate.
Yeah. Well, I always talk about how he grilled the administrator of the 1033 program under Obama,
right.
Which it was beautiful. So it's just shocking to see how much has changed since 2014, both within the Senate and within activist circles. Black Lives Matter is a totally different movement than what it was. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Michael. If you got more time, what are you thinking?
I think we covered pretty much everything. Unless you have anything to add,
Mila. Okay, yeah. So that's going to be our show for tonight. I implore you emphatically to all follow Michael Tracey on Substack, subscribe to him there, and also subscribe to him on Rockfin. I do not know your channel's name, but I'm sure
it's just M Tracey.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us. I love reading your writing. I look forward to reading more of it.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.